Welcome to the Global Education Colloquium here at Drexel University. We're very excited today to have Dave Paulson here to present some of his very exciting research on the Cham people in Vietnam. Dave Paulson is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at Temple University. His enduring research interests are committed to understanding the complex intersections of literacy, language endangerment, cultural socialization, and transformations to the broadly conceived material world. His doctoral dissertation research has been supported at different stages by the Temple Global Studies Program, the Wenner Gren Foundation, the Fulbright U.S. Student Program in Vietnam, and the National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation. Before coming to Temple, Dave conducted undergraduate studies at Southern Connecticut State University in anthropology with minors in Asian studies and psychology, as well as a master's degree in bilingual multicultural education and TESOL. At Temple University, Dave helped to establish the Visual Anthropology Society and has been a research fellow at the Center for Vietnamese Philosophy, Culture, and Society since 2011. For those of you new to the Colloquium, we are very excited to have both a face-to-face audience here in the room as well as an online audience. So after Dave completes his presentation, we'll have time for question and answer going back and forth between online and face-to-face. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, everyone. My name is Dave. I'm from Temple University, as you were just informed. And I just wanted to thank the organizers. I wanted to thank everybody in attendance. We have some friends from out of town today, some people from different universities around Philadelphia here in this room. And I think it's really wonderful that, Chrissy, you could help organize this together with the Global Education Colloquium today. So I'm really excited to share with you some of my experiences doing research in Vietnam. And yeah, so we'll begin. So I've changed the title of this. I originally had it listed as Play in the City, and talking about rural to urban migration, socialization, in the context of rural urban migration in Vietnam. And I changed it to include some of the Cham language. I feel that it's important to incorporate as many themes and ideas from local communities with whom we work as anthropologists to emphasize their ideas and kind of worldviews. And so the title of my presentation today is Now My, To Come and Go Between Literacies, Migration, Socialization, Language Revitalization Among the Descendants of Champa. So this talk I'm going to be talking about movement. And in movement, to get us moving, I'll start with a song. A Cham song begins, Tai mai mung de tai o. Who has come? Who has come from afar? Begins the Cham love song, Tai mai. And I say that because migration movement and ascribing cultural meaning to travel across distance are so prominent in Cham, are such common themes in Cham lives that they're often, or they're in this case, woven into the introduction of love songs. So my research is about the movement between rural and urban spaces among young people in the Cham community and how this movement and lifestyle informs the opportunities and experiences that they have for learning their indigenous language. There's been a lot of research in the last, I'd say, 2 decades about language endangerment and more recently concerning urbanization. And a common theme within this literature is how this processes of migrations often negatively affect the survival of the world's endangered languages. In many cases, people are tasked to deal with transformation to the material worlds and their socioeconomic livelihoods, and this presents fewer opportunities for the meaningful use and everyday engagement in indigenous forms of communication. This is especially true in rapidly developing nations, so-called rapidly developing nations such as Vietnam, where Cham, the language Cham, has been spoken in the central region of this part of the world since the 2nd century, but is only spoken by 0.1% of the total population in Vietnam today. Each year, fewer and fewer develop proficiency in Cham, and even fewer are develop proficiency in the indigenous writing system known as Akar Tra. Nevertheless, my project today, I want to emphasize or talk about how young people moving between rural and urban spaces are provided with new opportunities in their structure and frequency for learning and using the Cham language in a meaningful way. And I describe this process of movement between these places as a generative process of Now My. Again, the title of this presentation, Now My, Moving Between literacies. And so now mai is a Cham phrase meaning to come and to go. Now mai. So I examine it between rural environments, and within that context, Kanagaraja notes that communication is an actively and is fully embedded in the environment and situated in time-space conditions. So to come and go, to now mai, is a classical theme in the history of the Champa civilization. From the 2nd to the 19th century, this often called Indianized kingdom ruled throughout south-central Vietnam. And the topic of movement is paramount to the peopling of this region of the world. Originally, the Cham are descendants of people who migrated from areas of Taiwan, speaking Austronesian languages, moving into insular regions of Southeast Asia, and then finally settling around the 2nd century in mainland Southeast Asia here. And over the course of centuries, up until the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, this concept of now mai is something that is relevant to multiple regions of this part of the world. Within the Cham civilization, there are connections to South India and the Indian subcontinent, East Asia as well, and insular Southeast Asia here. And these things are reflected in the the elements of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam that have shaped Cham's spiritual belief systems, as well as languages like Sanskrit and Arabic that have shaped the contours of reading, writing, and speaking this Malaysian Polynesian language. And a common greeting in Cham is not to ask someone, how they're doing. Hey, Christy, how's it going? People ask, hey, where are you coming from? Which is a common thing in many languages. And in Cham is Doplay Mai. Where are you coming from? And place is so important or paramount that some people will even use the name of their village or play to refer to themselves, such as my friend Ikan di Ram, Mr. Ikan from Play Ram, the Ram village, or Mr. So Bodung, my friend So from Bodung village. Here I'm working towards an understanding of this process of migration, because I believe that this process of now mai is something that can build new perspectives in linguistic anthropology, and particularly in the context of migration, as well as studies of language endangerment and revitalization. So my research is focused on Panduranga, which is the southernmost state of the Champa civilization, known today as Ninh Thuan and Binh Thuan provinces. This is home to the largest Cham population of Cham people living in Vietnam, who often now mai between these different regional urban centers, such as Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon, Dalat, and Nha Trang. Saigon, often simply called the city, Tan Pho, by people in South Central Vietnam, is the largest metropolitan center in this region. And very few people who live here will describe themselves as being from Saigon, Người Saigon, but are rather people who've moved there from outside neighboring provinces and moved into the city. This lifestyle of movement between people between rural and urban areas is what inspires the multi-sided nature of my research over the course of my time in the field. The Cham living in Ho Chi Minh City often live on the outskirts of the center districts. And if anyone's, probably Chris, you're familiar with this map of Ho Chi Minh City, downtown here is some of the major, more metropolitan centers of the city, and as you move out, it tends to become more rural. And Eric Harms, anthropologist from Yale University, describes these as Saigon's edge, places that are not really rural and not really urban, but are in many ways sort of uncomfortably both. And the friends in my life that are from the Cham community, and many people from Panduranga, live in these two outer districts, Tu Duc and District 9, at the edge of the province there. So these places are home to many, many Cham people and friends and family members from Panduranga, and they're students, teachers, parents, directors, architects, artists, restaurant workers, bankers, among others. There's a whole variety of things that people do. And despite the diverse livelihoods of everyone in this group, they're still unrecognized as a distinct community within the space of the city. The transient nature of people who regularly now mai was described to me in the course of my research by different researchers and people as hum ổn định, chưa có định, or hum bình vững, not stable, not yet fixed, not yet lasting. A lot of these different terms to describe essentially an uncertain community. Okay? In this research today, what I'm looking to do is examine how a seemingly uncertain community generates enduring dividends for the vitality, preservation, and revitalization of endangered communicative traditions. While there is a more stable, often recognized Cham Muslim community in the city center, their linguistic and spiritual worlds are inspired by Islam more so than the traditional heritage of the Champa civilization. The Cham from Panduranga are well known for their maintenance of religious, ritual, and communicative traditions that are indigenous to Vietnam. And perhaps one of the most distinctive aspects of this is the writing system, again, Akan Tra. This is the oldest form of writing found in mainland Southeast Asia, based on 4th century inscriptions at the site called Trakiu. And the contemporary version of this orthography is based on inscriptions from a 17th century tower called Po Rome, which is located in Panduranga. And I love this place because here once more we see the importance of place, the centrality of place, where, you know, the notion of authenticity is embedded in this monument, and a lot of problems that arise for people learning this script come from deviations in the unintelligibility of the language as it's found here. Writing is paramount to Cham identity in so many ways. And some researchers in the late 20th century used literacy as a defining characteristic to describe the Cham people as separate from other groups in Vietnam, right? So in this case, writing becomes a marker of ethnic identity. And many people, as a result of this, feel that this growing trend of language shift and language endangerment and the potential of language loss within the community is, quote, very, very dangerous for the future of Cham for a number of different reasons. But as I want to share with you today, I want to look at some new movements between people, and as Vietnam changes and inspires people to move between the countryside and the city, what it does to their experiences of learning Cham. You know, and this is part of a broader global migrational pattern across the world where, quote, text, languages, and semiotic resources are crossing boundaries easily. Kanagaraja explains, as diverse and temporal geographic zones are brought closer together. So looking at this movement through time, my understanding of the Cham starts textually. And in the 19th century, foreign scholarship on the Cham and Champa started with French scholars from the French colonial government working in the field of anthropology, my own. And these colonial area texts from the people who would now mine to their research sites, they act as authoritative texts today because they're often sometimes the only materials available for information about Cham linguistic patterns or cultural traditions. But since this time, generations of European and American scholars have continued Cham research amounting to dictionaries, monographs, and different journal articles. And today, a new generation first there was later communist periods of ethnic minority scholarship following the two Indochina Wars. And today, a new generation of Cham scholars is working largely in Ho Chi Minh City to sort of decolonize these academic representations of Cham civilization and Cham history. You know, a majority of these publications are from people in the community now, located in Ho Chi Minh City, from individuals like Sakaya, Batrung Phu, and Rasara, among others. I commend all of those gentlemen and individuals for their work. So taking together this history of Cham epistemology, as I'm calling it here, has been distributed across multiple locations around the world, right? The knowledge about Cham is largely embedded in place, depending on where the scholars are coming from. And at the same time, it presents us with different ways to read Cham history. So there's different literacies that one might develop in your understanding of Cham if you're just looking at the text. But as an anthropologist, we don't base things solely in text, but have the insistence that ethnographic fieldwork and participant observation in the local everyday lives of people is paramount to a thorough and deep understanding of people's lives. So what I'm going to follow with are some examples from my 24 months of research that I did. I spent 2 years of my life in Vietnam so far, and various things related to this project. And I'm going to share some of those experiences with you today. And so the methods of ethnography are something that incorporates participant observation and audiovisual recording of different events, making later transcriptions of those, depending on what kind of information you're looking for in the data, and then talking with people that were in these recordings about their experiences and the meanings therein. I also conducted open-ended interviews, and I conducted textual analysis of print and other literacy materials that are relevant to people's lives in this setting. And so, starting from all of this, there's a lot of data for me to look at. And the textual stuff is some of the first things that I looked at in people's experiences living in the city. And one area of my research here is looking at people's personal diaries and looking at journaling. And this became a really interesting theme in the course of my understanding of the relationship between the countryside and the city. As people moving into the city for the first time are entering into, for the first time in their life, a place where they live that's predominantly Vietnamese speaking. In the countryside, it's Cham at home, and definitely Vietnamese outside in the city for business purposes and stuff, but it's a largely Cham world. Whereas in the city, it's a really different experience. And so investigating these diaries and looking at the things that people are writing about their experiences and personal reflections and things like that, I felt were really illustrative. And I'll just play you a clip of a small...
Sử dụng ngôn ngữ tiếng Việt bập bẹ nói ra trước đám đông là sự đánh trước.
So that was the opening line of this, which says that ethnic minority people là dân tộc thiểu số phải sử dụng ngôn ngữ tiếng Việt. The ethnic minority people have to use Vietnamese bè nói ra trước đám đông làm mình sợ lắm chứ. You have to use it in the face of these crowded areas in the city, in this new environment kind of thing, and it makes people worried or upset or afraid. Very. And so looking at these personal diaries, I felt was an interesting way for me to get a sense of people's sort of affective experiences moving into the cities, but also think through the ways that literacy is used here in this case, where this is a form of Vietnamese literacy used for reflective writing. And so that really helped me outline the ways that different literacies are constructed in relation to one another. In the city, though, there's a lot going on, and this really opened me up to literacies beyond language, not restricted to simply reading and writing text, but also looking at other kinds of literacy, like multiple literacies, like musical literacies, for example. So I'm going to show you a few examples of experiences of Cham people. And the first of these snapshots is from community education classes in Ho Chi Minh City that were held during 2015 and 2016. And these are sponsored by CVN, which is the Center for Educational Exchange with Vietnam, and they were aimed at teaching young people and others in the community about traditional aspects of Cham heritage. Things like there was an educational course in the alphabet, there was certain things in instrumentation, dance performance, and folk music. So when I entered fieldwork in 2016, in early 2016, the spring, these courses were just coming to a close, and I was able to attend the Cham folk music class. And I thought, folk music, okay, that'll be cool. I'm here to study about language. But this was really, really eye-opening for me in a lot of ways because it showed me how Cham script is used in conjunction with other forms of literacy, such as music. So in the clip that follows, what I'm going to show you is a group of students learning of Cham folk song in an arrangement called a Do Pandao. Do Pandao is like a call and response style of folk music singing that features, quote, flirtatious verses bandied from one another, from one singer to another. So in the past, this type of singing is something that people would use to introduce themselves, make acquaintance, and establish courtship relations through song. Okay, so like at the end of the day, you could sing, and I'd be like, "Hey, Christy, my name is Dave. I'm from Temple University," and you'd be like, "Hey, Dave, I'm from Drexel." Right? So this is a communicative genre, not simply just a song with notation, but has a communicative dimension to it as well. And so I'm considering this communicative. I'm considering folk music as a form of social action. In the context of the classroom, students are learning how to perform this traditional song, but they're also developing literacy skills in reading the song lyrics and writing it in traditional Akantra script. So in the city, it still functioned, this song, traditionally in the countryside is a form of introduction. But in my research, I'm examining it as a way that a new generation of people are being introduced to the heritage of their parents in terms of language language, music, and other forms of aesthetic. And so I'll show you just a short, brief clip here, if I can get this to play. All right. So what we're learning here is this back and forth call and response style of singing. And this is an original note that I got from the indigenous Cham scholar Tan Phan when he was explaining to me what exactly I was learning in these classes. And I think this is really interesting because this here too, if you look at the lyrics, people are being socialized through the language to this musical structure. Do means to sing. And again, now my, come and go, right? So sing, now, sing, my, to come and go. This is an interesting and indigenous structural form of music that comes embedded, this musical literacy comes embedded with a knowledge of the language. And I argue here that the loss of language is not simply a structural system like a grammar that you could use, but also includes the pragmatic and sociocultural functions in an everyday sense, as well as in the context of music here. And looking at this, you know, I've looked at a lot of this data in various different ways, and I love the fact that community participation in this context of education is paramount. No single person, including myself, has a fully fluent understanding of this structure or the song or anything about it, because this is literally the first day that I had actually gone to the class. And this is what Blomer calls a truncated multilingualism, where people are, or in this case, we're able to work together through our different levels of knowledge to achieve an approximate performance of the musical and linguistic task at hand. There's a course instructor, but students are not passive recipients. People work collaboratively to give directions, and in what Hutchins called the distributive nature of human cognition. Hand gestures seen here index the relative literacies that people have for the proper tonality and pronunciation of the language, and people are directed to use their voice more prominently or discreetly depending on the lyrical content and timing of the utterance. So in this way, language socialization is embodied and is also intimately tied to forms of understanding music. I want to draw, yeah, okay, so I think we've still got some time. I'm going to draw your attention now to the other way. So in this case, we're looking at how understandings of language within the content of this song lead people to a greater understanding of music. And so I will now take you to show you how understandings of music lead people to greater understandings of language in this sense. So this pictured here is a page from one of the books of these classrooms featuring the song Tai Mai, which is the song that I sang you at the beginning of this, Who Has Come From Afar. So a close examination of this text and ways that it was engaged by the students using their corrective marks, I think it really helps to illuminate the various background knowledges that people bring to learning about heritage in this context of community education. So as pictured here, there are a number of corrective marks that are going on from some of the students and explanatory notes that were used to make this piece of reading material more clear. And like the previous clips, to make it more clear. So I'm going to highlight 3 specific examples really quick just in this text. There's a lot to say here, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to highlight 3 points. And first, there's the direct translation of song lyrics into Vietnamese. So folk music in Cham often has a lot of words and phrases that were once really common but have now fallen out of use because of people using Vietnamese more predominantly. And you can see this in the way that people are making sense of translating the meanings of the lyrics in their own personal work. So the word here, mang, for example, is annotated with its Vietnamese equivalent moi, to have just done something. The second aspect of this that I find compelling is that Vietnamese phonetics are used to produce glosses of Cham pronunciation. So the word do, so D-A-O-K, as it would be written in this spelling of Cham, is retranscribed using the phonetics of Vietnamese, T-H-O, t, right? So they're innovative enough to use the diacritics of a tonal language to account for the contours of Cham's singing in a musical performance. And the last aspect of these corrections that I want to share today is that they're taking place in the space of Rumi, or Latin-based character systems, for writing akantra, right? So at the top of this page, as you saw, there's the traditional script, and then all of the meta-linguistic work that the student is doing is largely outside of the traditional form of orthography. So there are a number of extended analyses you can get into with information like this. But from these points, you're able to see a snapshot about how Cham literacy is positioned in relation to other more frequently used language varieties. In this case, Vietnamese is used as the basis for understanding the underlying phonetic structure of a linguistic system, and is also used to clarify lexical content of an endangered language. More crucially, I think, the relatively low literacy skills in Akan Tra lead students to look elsewhere for metalinguistic negotiations, and they find solace in other more commonly used Latin-based systems. So while Cham orthography is described as emblematic of Cham identity by researchers, it sometimes occupies a very tertiary position after national and foreign language alternatives. But socialization experiences like these are not singular and contained within a single day or experience or thing like that. They're drawn out over a long period of time, and one of the hallmarks of anthropological research is that it's long-term in nature. And so over the course of months and the 2 years that I've spent there, I've grown to know a lot of people in the Cham community very closely and see their progression in terms of how they identify with aspects of traditional heritage, as well as their kind of day-to-day activities for cultural performances and other types of learning that take place in an informal way. And in the course of these heritage classes, they were able to continue developing a student group, which formed as a result of these experiences, called Kik Nam Krung, which means preserve the memory. And they've worked to produce T-shirts and other ephemera that feature the traditional Akan Tra writing system, as well as participate in performances at the annual Kate Ramawan Festival held at the University of Social Sciences. And so you can see from these beginnings, again, I showed you a clip from the first day that I had ever gone to these classes, which over the course of time later in the year, so that was in probably February or November, and then by March, people have got this structural back and forth singing down to the point where it can be showcased at a large community event. So the long-term perspective of anthropology gives you a sense about how understandings and participation and motivations that people have for developing these competencies kind of take place. And in this case, musical literacies have created space for the acquisition of written language, which in turn helps to develop literacies for cultural aesthetics and embodied performances, and even the biomechanics of using traditional instruments, all of which are situated in relation to literacies in foreign and national languages. So I'm here really intrigued by this landscape of literacies that are going on, and I am working towards, looking at their different instantiations in rural and urban settings, and how the sustained movement between places gives people a different understanding of each of them. These demonstrate a key theoretical contribution that I'm working to make with my dissertation work that works towards a semiotic understanding of literacy. I use the term semiotic literacies as a recognition of, one, the symbolic values of different literacy forms and the implications they have for shaping the world, and two, an examination of people's emergent literacies in reading and writing the symbolic world, as it manifests itself in language, material objects, spaces, embodiments, and human relationships. I think that this kind of work is very much in line with a lot of recent linguistic or anthropological work focusing on linguistic materiality, as well as relationships between language and music as a powerful intersection for the larger project of language revitalization. Other scholars have investigated this with the Sami populations of Europe, looking at hip hop and the importance of music for revitalizing the language, as well as the work of Pasha Fordry's work on music and revitalization of Mazatec language in Mexico. Lastly, our exploration of Cham communicative practices here accords well with a lot of scholarship on language and migration, which emphasizes spatial repertoires that people have, or the diverse semiotic resources necessary for interactional successes across time and space. So I maintain the perspective of semiotic literacies is something that helps further understanding of the relationship between literacy, orality, in the context of language endangerment, as well as in this case of migration, how movement between space affects these processes. All of these literacy forms are embedded in place in some way, and semiotic literacies across the play in the city are given different meanings and sociocultural values that are linked to contemporary political and economic conditions of Vietnam. And it's not just knowing kind of locally what people do outside of more accepted or institutionalized forms of literacy, but crucially how they now mine between them, right? So the movement between literacies is the key. There are a lot of researchers who have examined multiple literacies, for example, what kids do with reading and writing at home versus in the classroom kind of thing. And here, I'm not just looking at kind of local alternatives to kind of the institutional hegemony, but looking at how people move between them in a very local sense and then in other languages as well. And again, key here being movement, the now mai, the movement between literacies is something that helps facilitate understanding of them. And so from that, we can see that in this context of people from the countryside living in the city helps people move back to home spaces with knowledge about where they came from. And at the same time, the city has helped to grow with its student population, wage laborers, and consumers who, while temporary or seemingly uncertain, are an integral part in the growth of development of this part of Southeast Asia. So tradition is not something just found in the countryside, you know, kind of in the outskirts of modernity, but it's also a dividend of the modernizing process in rapidly developing nations like Vietnam. As people move between them, they help to, these spaces, I believe, that create one another. There's elements of the city that are brought back to the countryside, and there's elements of the countryside that are refined within urban environments. So the socialization experiences of people, of Cham people in this context help to illustrate the essential role that ethnic minority groups play in this country's transformation, in this process, particularly of rural to urban migration, and as well as how indigenous languages and in forms of literacy help to constitute Vietnam's ascension into modernity. So at this point, I would like to just share with you that I'm part of a research collective called Cham Studies, and we have a website called chamstudies.net where there's a whole world of different scholarship from all around the world, the United States, Europe, Vietnam, among others. And with some people in this research collective, we're intending to work towards eventually one day an edited volume on the relationship between the countryside and the city and movement, you know, in Cham history, Cham civilization, and contemporary Cham communities around the world today. So at this juncture, I think we have to all now back to our house or wherever we came from. But I hope that I can leave you with a sense that what it means to now mind, what does it mean to come and go in life, and what does that do for your understandings of who you are and the different types of ways that you communicate with people in the world. What we might call literacies. How this process helps to inform who we become, and how our ability to read and write in symbolic ways is tied to the spaces within which and through we communicate. Thanks. All right.
We have plenty of time for questions, conversations.
Okay.
So I will let you call on people, and I'll let you know if there's people
Okay.
online who chat in a question.
Okay, yeah. So we have live stream. So just to facilitate this as well, we have people in the room. There's a live stream here, which is on YouTube, and there's also a Facebook live stream going on that I think probably a lot of people in Vietnam are. Is there people watching this?
Yeah, some.
All right. Hey.
They can chat if there are
Hello.
questions, and we'll read them
Yeah, if there's questions, nếu có câu hỏi gì thì hỏi David nhé.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can't think.
Okay. Yeah, so we'll just open the floor up to anybody who might have anything.
Okay, let me say something in Cham language. What the way David này bị quá thì bây giờ hay đâu can sure now that kind of. I just tell people in Vietnam what they have any question they can raise it up and then I translate it back.
Okay. Yeah, go for it.
So, as you know, I do work on Vietnam as well, and with some ethnic minority groups. And one of the things that's always interesting is the gender dynamics.
Yeah.
Again, of who's reading and writing, who's attending cultural events,
For
who's
sure.
expected to display cultural preservation versus be modernity. Does this come into play at all in sort of the context in which you're working? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Totally. This is such a beautiful area to look at in the context of the world of Cham. I'll just start with a gender perspective. The Cham community is one of the only remaining matrilineal societies still in the world, right? So everything follows the female line. And so I say that because there are often, in a lot of aspects, a very particular distribution related to gender and social activity, sociocultural norms, cultural traditions, etc. And so in the past, literacy particularly was a very male-dominated thing, from especially religious dignitaries who would be tasked to use texts in different ceremonial contexts, and they would be people that would dedicate their life study to literacy in their indigenous writing system. And so what's interesting now is that it's in the context that I'm looking at in contemporary Vietnam, it's very much kind of turning those gender norms on their head, where literacy is something that's shared by all people, you know? And so people now today, for example, the group Kik Nam Krung is both male and female, and it's young students who are really excited to just try and get together and work to promote and preserve every aspect of their heritage, you know? And so it's a really interesting time to think about it from a gendered perspective about what does writing mean and where does that come from, and the ways that sort of transformations to Vietnam now, you know, upend older norms of gender and make it more inclusive in some ways, you know? So thanks for that question. It's a really interesting point. Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit about why you focused on language preservation and literacy as opposed to cultural preservation broadly?
Yeah, so I went there, I went to Vietnam originally to look at language specifically. As a linguistic anthropologist, that was like one of my original interests in going to Vietnam. And so my experiences and the things, I mean, it's a short presentation today, but in the scope of my dissertation and sort of a fundamental stance of anthropology is that language is never isolated. Language never lives alone, and language never comes from nowhere. It's always connected to larger spheres of cultural and spiritual understandings of the world, you know? And so very much in this sense is definitely a study, I think, and a reflection of that whole kind of spectrum of indigenous tradition, you know, but told through the lens of language. As a linguistic anthropologist, looking at like how language and the social world create one another, you know? So that's just the perspective from my field and my orientation that I'm taking to tell that story kind of thing, you know? Yeah. Yeah. Hey.
Sort of building off of that and just kind of my own curiosities, what role do the sort of local sanctuaries or temples play in any of this? Do they ever interact with the cultural performances?
Yeah, so yeah, Cham temples are a form of living heritage for sure. And so they are something that people will regularly visit, you know, just kind of informally with friends, but they are the centerpieces of the largest Cham festivals throughout the year. So there's a festival called Kate during the 7th month of the Cham calendar, and at that time the whole community visits temples to pray for gods and renewal. And there's three really popular ones in southern Vietnam that people visit. And at that time, there's like a whole kind of script of things that people have to follow step by step to perform these rituals properly. And so these things are not just symbols for things like literacy or cultural or religious identity, but are very much a part of living heritage today that become very meaningful. And for the specific topic of temples, I would suggest looking at Istvan's work, Istvan Champa, who can be found at chamstudies.net, and his work is looking at the intersections of indigenous management of these temples versus the kind of governmental approaches that take a very sort of like tourism development, very bureaucratic sort of approach, and kind of the problems that happen when those two worlds collide and how to think through a better future for them. But Cham temples, as you can see here, in this symbol is a very iconic or emblematic aspect of Cham life, for sure. So, thanks.
So, language revitalization, of course, is a very difficult thing to pull off. And at any given moment, there are revitalization projects going on all around the world.
Mhm.
It seems like a pretty successful one in the broad perspective. Is there anything that you see as a particular challenge to the success of language revitalization in the Cham case?
So I often ask that question in the course of my research. You know, I think often a very sort of distance approach and just ask people like, what's happening to your language and what do you think is needed for it, kind of thing. And one of the biggest challenges, especially in the case that I talked about today of looking at the city, is space. Space is paramount, where people feel that there's a lot of interest, but there's no material dimension to that. You know, where those classes were held was in a rented room that has nothing particular to the community. And because there's sort of an unrecognized group within the city, it would be harder to make a claim to any kind of, you know, four walls, especially in the center of the city where that was located. So space remains a huge issue, and that incorporates a lot of different, you know, bureaucratic and kind of structural obstacles, you know, and then just trying to get financial resources to, once you have the space, what can you do to do some kind of programming or something like that in it. So I would largely say that, and if you look at the Cham communities in the United States, for example, I think the Sacramento community is exemplary of this, where in the past, you know, there's a lot of Cham people living there, but not a real coordinated sense of revitalization in the same ways that happened when they bought a house. And so the community in Sacramento bought a house, and they have a property that's like an acre or half acre, I think, and they get together every Sunday, and it creates this common ground for people to establish, for kids to do language learning, for them to have cultural events and stuff like that, you know? So I would say that that's paramount for sure.
Nobody else have a question? I do have one.
Okay,
Hi.
yeah.
Hello, my name is Isa Kosim. I'm a Cham from Vietnam. I was here since 1981, escaped out of Vietnam. So it's very honor to be a guest in this presentation of David Paulson. First, I would like to say thank you. We are very grateful for your work. You reviving our culture, our language. Thank you very much for that.
I'm just a bridge to share the stories of
The
others.
second thing, I think my wife, Hang, and me been asking the question, what bring you to this topic? What bring you to the Cham culture and the Cham activity? What interest you find about it?
I often am asked this question, why Cham, why Vietnam? And my response in many ways is first serendipity and then destiny. That's my answer. Serendipitously, I was led to Vietnam the first time by a research grant through Michelle Thompson at Southern Connecticut State University to study Vietnamese language. At that point in time in my life, I was intended to do or intending to do Latin American studies in the Dominican Republic, and she said, you should try and apply for this grant. And I did, made it, got to Vietnam, and just fell in love with the world there. And so that was just a life-changing experience for me. And so as I continued to visit Vietnam during my undergraduate and master's studies, I was continually drawn to the ethnic minorities of Vietnam. As you know, everybody's heard of Vietnam, but not many know that it's a largely multi-ethnic, multilingual country. And there's officially accepted 54 different ethnic minorities within Vietnam, each with their own distinct linguistic and cultural traditions, kind of thing. And so, being based in Ho Chi Minh City, or Saigon, I was introduced to a Cham friend at the University of Social Sciences. And I said, I would love to learn just a few words or phrases of your language. And the first time we met, he invited me to come to the countryside from the city. That was my first experience. We had coffee, we talked a little language things, and I went to the countryside for the Ramadan festival, Ramawan in Cham. Which is a local version of the Islamic practice of Ramadan. And so right from the very beginning, it was like jumping right in. And I feel that that sense of hospitality and that warm welcome that people within the Cham community showed me, within the first few days, it felt like I was at home with family. And I feel like that aspect, that warmth and that caring nature of the Cham people in those early experiences are what helped me to develop my commitment to the Cham people of the world and the Cham language and cultural traditions. So you have to thank the Cham people for that.
Another question is, during your 2 years in Vietnam,
Yes.
what do you feel about the openness and the hospitality from the government? Did you get allowed to go anywhere you want for the research?
Yeah, so that's, it can be really complicated, you know, especially because I went with the Fulbright program, and so research in Vietnam is a very different bureaucratic space. If anyone's done research there, I believe, Christy, you know well about. It's complicated as foreigners because we're not from Vietnam, and the levels of permissions that have to be granted and things like that. And at first it was really troubling because I didn't know how to navigate the system. I didn't know how to ask for anything or how to get permissions to do anything. And it was just like a back and forth. And that caused me to change a lot of aspects of my research. In the past, before I had gone to Vietnam, you know, for the long-term project, I was thinking I'm going to go to schools and study these classes, you know, a very kind of institutional approach, which I thought would be good on paper, you know, but it's turned out that the levels of approval for going into institutional spaces is way, way more complicated. And so everyday experiences, informal learning environments became my primary focus of my research because it just naturally came about as opposed to my experiences. You know, so while it was troublesome doing certain institutional things there, it was also really illuminating. Like even just waiting for permissions. So in Vietnam, you have to affiliate with like an institution there. You can't just like show up, I am a scholar, you know, with the Fulbright program, you're partnered with a host institution. And so even the process of just doing the paperwork for me was one of the most illustrative and enriching experiences of my whole time in Vietnam. The hand-drawn diagram of the singing practice that I showed you came from me literally just sitting in a friend's house waiting to send our approval in the mail, kind of thing, you know? So it's troublesome, but also productive, very much so.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Glad to hear that.
yeah.
Another question.
Okay.
This is fearful. I don't want to ask, but I have to.
Okay.
After, let's say, you got your doctorate degree,
Mm-hmm.
will you drop the Cham culture? Or
Never.
Will you come back? Or
Of course.
What's your plan? What's your future plan?
Well, I mean, in terms of working, you know, the academic world is often an uncertain one. So I don't want to make any projections for that, but I can say that Vietnam and life in the Cham community is definitely my second home and will always be that way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's the answer I want to hear.
Thanks. We have no questions online here, so if there are any burning questions in the room. If not, then let me thank you very much for sharing
Thank you.
your expertise and your time today. It's really exciting to hear about your research, and we wish you all the best in carrying it forward to the dissertation.
Thank you.
And look forward to future research from you. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you everyone for coming today, and for those of you online as well, thank you. This will be archived and recorded for people who didn't make it. And we have our next colloquium, I believe, May 15th. We have Dr. Marnie Sommer, who's coming in from Columbia University to talk to us about menstrual hygiene management and its intersection with education. So please come back for that. Again, thank you.
Thank you.